Exactly 1 year ago, the PlayStation 5 Slim was released, which frankly didn't surprise anyone at all. The only notable thing about it was that it replaced the fat version with identical hardware, as there hadn't been a similar redesign in previous generations. Then, a year later, the Pro version came out, and it certainly made an impression, although not always a positive one, especially when you consider the price. So today I decided to compare them head to head, examining the differences between the two models not only in terms of design, but also technically. And of course, we'll try to determine whether the upgrade can truly enhance your gaming experience. Spoiler, it can. But the real question is, by how much? Without further ado, let's dive in. Let's start with the most obvious aspect, the design. The console's appearance always sparks heated debates since it's the first thing that catches your eye. And while the PS5 Slim and PS5 Pro might seem similar at first glance, there are indeed differences. Let's break them down step by step. First off, both consoles retain the same futuristic style that has become the hallmark of the 9th generation of PlayStation. This design has been nicknamed everything from air conditioner to humidifier and more. Yet even after 4 years, walking into a room, your eyes are inevitably drawn to the console. Even if an Xbox Series X is sitting next to it, it blends into the background as if it's in stealth mode. The designers stuck with the signature black and white color scheme, smooth curves of the body, and the characteristic lighting strip at the center. In the Pro version, unlike the original Fat model, this light strip extends all the way down and shines brighter, even during the day, but still manages not to be distracting at night. Both consoles can be placed vertically or horizontally, but here's where the irony kicks in. This detail stirred up the entire internet. Unlike the original PS5, neither the Slim nor the Pro comes with a vertical stand in the box. Instead, you get two plastic clips that encourage you to lay the console on its side. This, firstly, doesn't look great aesthetically, especially if there's a disk drive, which sticks out awkwardly like a hernia. And secondly, while this omission might be somewhat understandable for the Slim, excluding the stand from the Pro, priced at €800, seems downright greedy. After all, the stand doesn't cost much compared to the console itself. And I'm sure there will always be people ready to defend Sony's decisions. They always show up, but it's precisely because of them that Sony feels emboldened to pull the same moves with future consoles. However, if the missing stand is only a minor inconvenience, the situation with the disk drive is a much bigger issue. It's not included in the package either. Essentially, the PS5 Pro is a digital edition, and there's no alternative version. If you want a disk drive, you'll need to buy it separately. Predictably, with the hype around the Pro version and the limited availability of these drives, their prices have started to rise treacherously, like Bitcoin not long ago. But there are some positives. Side panels from the Slim version will fit the Pro, though only the bottom ones. Still, that's enough to cover the disk drive slot if needed. Overall, in terms of design, the Pro version has definitely improved. The oddly glossy top panels have been replaced. Decorative ribs for air intake have been reintroduced near the central black spine, enhancing the cooling aesthetics. Plus, the 3 lines running across the middle add a unique touch, almost like a nod to the PS4 Pro with its similar triple-layer design. Now let's talk about size. When the original PS5 first launched, its massive dimensions left everyone impressed, especially compared to the previous generation. But now that we've gotten used to it, it doesn't seem so enormous anymore. The Slim version is noticeably smaller, while the Pro sits somewhere in between, acting as a transitional variant. In terms of height, it's the same as the original, but its width and thickness are identical to the Slim. One key change, though, is harder to notice at first glance: the redesigned cooling system. It's now quieter and, according to Sony, more efficient, even though the original PS5 and the Slim already operated quietly, except for the disk drive, which sounded like it was giving birth to the disk. The Pro is practically silent. It maintains reasonable temperatures even during the most demanding scenes. To sum up the design section, the PS5 Pro retains the best features of the base model, but adds more functionality and refinement. It's still the same sleek, modern-looking console, but with improvements I personally would have liked to see in the Slim, especially the central air intake ribs. But as the saying goes, to each their own. Feel free to share in the comments which design you like more. Before we move on to comparing the consoles and games, let's refresh our memory on their technical specifications to understand what exactly Sony's engineers have conjured up this time. Let's start with the processor, which is identical in both consoles. It's an AMD Ryzen Zen 2 with 8 cores and 16 threads. The difference lies in the clock speed. The base model runs at 3.5 GHz, while the Pro can boost up to 3.8 GHz. And that's probably the limit, because I get the feeling that if Sony could have pushed it to at least 4 GHz, they would have. This is actually a significant issue, as games that are CPU intensive won't see much improvement. And the trend is clear. There will only be more such games in the future, which isn't exactly great news. Next, we have the GPU, where the differences are more noticeable. Before the Pro's release, leaks teased 23 teraflops, which sounded almost too good to be true. And, as it turned out, it was. In reality, the Pro delivers 16.7 teraflops, which is still nearly 50% more than the base model, a fact Sony loves to highlight. But just as a point of reference, let me casually drop here the GPU specs of the base Xbox Series X, just in case anyone's curious. But on a more serious note, the GPU in the Pro is based on the more modern RDNA 3 architecture, while the Slim and original models are still on the second generation. The Pro also boasts 60 compute units, compared to only 36 in the previous models. It's clear that the focus was placed entirely on upgrading the GPU. I'll share my thoughts on why that might be a bit later. As for the rest, the Pro version comes with 2 terabytes of storage, reportedly with faster RAID speeds than the Slim. However, in practice, there's no noticeable difference when launching games. Maybe a few seconds faster, but nothing dramatic. Definitely not the leap we experienced with the launch of the 9th generation. Additionally, the Pro has 2 extra gigabytes of RAM dedicated to running the operating system. One thing worth praising is the inclusion of Wi-Fi 7, which feels noticeably faster at downloading games compared to Wi-Fi 6 on earlier models. And that's about it. In essence, the Pro version lives up to its name as an intermediate step between generations. Here, Sony kept the same core hardware like the processor, but introduced a new feature, PSSR upscaling, and upgraded the GPU to handle it effectively. If we set aside the larger storage, 2 extra gigabytes of RAM, and other minor tweaks, the GPU upgrade is really the only major change. It's akin to swapping out the graphics card in a PC while leaving everything else untouched. However, in the console world, this might make sense. It gives developers a chance to familiarize themselves with the new technology during the remaining couple of years of the 9th generation. That way, by the time the PS6 launches, they'll already know how to utilize it effectively. But the question remains, why do regular users need this? Let's see how this innovation actually impacts gaming performance. I should warn you right away, most of the tests were conducted on older games, which, while patched, were still designed for the base version of the console. Personally, I think this is Sony's problem, not mine, for failing to launch the Pro alongside new releases. This generation has struggled with delivering new titles, but it is what it is. Let's start with Marvel's Spider-Man 2, which I praised in my recent review of the Pro. The differences here are indeed noticeable. Sharper visuals, much more pronounced and pleasant ray tracing that transforms the city, especially in the rain. But that's about it. The Pro adds 2 new modes, Fidelity Pro and Performance Pro, essentially enhanced versions of the base model's quality and performance modes. The funniest part is that Fidelity mode, which focuses on visual quality, still caps the frame rate at 30 frames per second, even on the Pro version. That said, the graphical differences between the 2 consoles are apparent in this mode. However, as even Mark Cerny, who presented the Pro, mentioned, statistics show that most players prefer the performance mode. And here, you still get the same 60 frames per second, just with slightly more stable performance. In demanding scenes, frame drops are less frequent, but graphically, the difference is almost non-existent. If I remove the labels, you wouldn't even be able to tell which console the image came from. Go ahead, pause the video and share your opinion. I bet most of you wouldn't guess correctly. And this is an exclusive from an internal Sony studio, one that focuses on optimizing their games specifically for their own consoles. So what happens with third-party titles? That's an interesting question. For instance, shortly after the Pro's release, reports started surfacing about the new console breaking graphics in certain games. Titles like Silent Hill 2 sparked entire Reddit threads full of complaints. The same happened with Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Fortunately, these issues were patched quickly, but it's still a troubling signal. This supports my theory that the Pro version is more for developers to learn how to work with the new PSSR upscaling technology, so that by the time the PlayStation 6 launches, they can avoid buggy releases. After all, a poorly optimized lineup at launch would be a massive blow to Sony's reputation. But let's take a look at how other games perform. The remake of Resident Evil 4 also received a patch for the Pro version. I don't even see the point in comparing unpatched games, as they're nearly identical. So, in Resident Evil, the differences are that now you can play with ray tracing at a stable 60 frames per second. Additionally, during moments when the FPS on the regular version drops by a couple of frames, it remains stable on the Pro. But to be honest, while playing from a couch several meters away, I didn't notice much of a difference. Maybe it's because the game itself is quite dark, making it harder to spot any differences in low-light conditions. So let's take another exclusive, although now also available on PC, Horizon Forbidden West. Here, 2 additional modes were added with the Pro prefixed to the standard Fidelity and Performance modes. It's worth noting that the game already looks stunning on the regular version, and on the Pro, it's just slightly better. In the Performance Preferred mode, it still locks at 60 frames per second, while the quality mode sticks to 30. The picture is further enhanced through PSSR upscaling from 1800p to 4K. Is this noticeable to the naked eye? Yes, if you compare two images side by side, but it's certainly not the kind of result you'd expect when buying a console that costs $400 more. Of course, it's possible that future games will show a much more noticeable difference. But here, Sony is to blame for releasing the console without any new exclusives for it. Let's take another game for comparison from a third-party studio, Stellar Blade. It's one of the few games where the difference is genuinely noticeable. While the regular version runs at only 30 frames per second, the Pro manages over 50, albeit not very stable, but still a clear improvement. However, this applies to the quality mode. In performance mode, both consoles maintain a stable 60 frames per second. The game already supports native 4K, but with the new upscaling mode, it offers more detailed textures. Again, this is noticeable only in static frames with zooming, but noticeable nonetheless. Similarly, the use of PSSR introduces a slight ripple effect on fine details due to frame generation. Nvidia seemed to have solved this issue a few years ago, but here, it's a newer technology that still needs refinement. This further supports my theory about polishing all of this for the next generation. Overall, there are still very few games where the differences between the two consoles are truly significant. There's also the matter of improved games from the previous generation, though this feels more like a bonus. Some games do genuinely get better, like Bloodborne or Elden Ring, where not only does the frame rate become more stable, but the textures also look slightly sharper. However, for everything else, especially games locked at 30 frames by the developers, the experience remains largely the same. So, in the end, the Pro version can definitely deliver better visuals, but there's one major but, and it's not even the price or the minor graphical differences, it's the lack of games that truly showcase the potential of the PS5 Pro. I'm still somewhat baffled as to why Sony chose this particular year to release their new console, especially when they've had almost no major releases besides Astro Bot, which runs great even on the regular version, and Final Fantasy VII. There's practically nothing to compare on these consoles right now. That said, I assume that over time, especially with the release of new games, the difference will naturally become more apparent. I'm particularly eager to see GTA 6 to compare, not just across one, but multiple console generations. That's when we'll really see the Pro's potential pushed to the max. By that time, prices might even drop. Christmas sales have already started, making the console more affordable. And within a year, the resale market will likely stabilize as well. In general, I still don't quite get the appeal for myself. Sure, it's clear that the console is more powerful and provides a more responsive experience, but it doesn't make 60 frames the new standard, forcing you to settle for 30 at maximum settings, and the native 4K remains the same. Essentially, it feels like upgrading a graphics card within the same generation. If you have the money and are chasing the best visuals, then sure, go for the Pro. But then comes the question, why not add a bit more and build a better PC instead? For everyone else, the slim or standard models will more than suffice until the end of this generation. The PS5 Pro feels more like a testing ground for developers to get comfortable with PSSR technology, so that by the time the PlayStation 6 releases, we won't face the same issues we're seeing now. New technology sometimes even degrades certain games, requiring additional patches. So, do you want to be a beta tester for $800, or would you rather buy a good 4K TV for your standard PS5? That's a decision everyone has to make for themselves.